I would, yeah, it just started now. Okay, I'd like to call on Ayat Hama-Saleh to introduce our next speaker, who is David Lapp. Ayat.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim. Hello, everyone. I'm really honored to introduce our first speaker, David Lapp. David is a professional engineer registered in Ontario who graduated with a Bachelor of Light Science in Geological Engineering from the University of Toronto in 1978. Following a career of nearly 20 years in consulting engineering and scientific investigation of marine navigation in ice-covered water, David joined Engineers Canada as Director of Professional Affairs in 1997. For the next 23 years, he assumed a variety of roles at Engineers Canada in international affairs, engineering qualification and practice-related guidelines on infrastructure and climate change, environmental engineering and sustainability issues related to engineering practice. In this capacity, David supported the development, implementation, and ongoing program support for PEO-Peterborough engineering protocol, a qualitative process to assess climate risk and vulnerability of civil infrastructure and buildings at screening level. Please help me to welcome David Lapp to that podium.
Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to put up my presentation here. Here. My apologies. I'm going to just stop for a second here and just restart again. Sorry. I just have to. Actually, Louis, could you put this up for me, because I can't seem to get it up onto a slideshow, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Don't worry.
My apologies, people.
We actually saw your slides, David.
Yeah, it's just that I couldn't get into slideshow mode, so my apologies for that.
Do now?
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm only going to be fairly brief, just to give an overview of climate change implications for engineering. And I'm taking this from the perspective of particularly focusing on climate change adaptation, recognizing that the other strategy to deal with climate change is mitigation, which is the reduction of greenhouse gases. And of course, you've heard words already about the role and the need for engineers to be involved in that through the development and implementation of technologies and processes that will reduce our greenhouse gases. But I'm going to focus primarily on adaptation side, which is to deal with the impacts of climate, particularly on our civil infrastructure and buildings. Next slide. So what we have to deal with as engineers is the fact that in the past, we considered climate to be a relatively stable parameter in our design, operations, and maintenance of infrastructure. But now, with our climate changing, you can see here the bottom line, or the common word here, is change. Changes in temperature, extreme winds, precipitation, and so forth. And all of these changes we have to deal with for infrastructure that has a life cycle of anywhere between 25 and 100 years going forward. So in essence, our climate is non-stationary. Therefore, we have to account for it. But of course, there's a lot of uncertainty with future climate, and therefore, that is another source of uncertainty that we have to deal with in our design, operations, and maintenance. Next slide. So if you could just click on this, Louis, for me. Essentially, you have an infrastructure threshold, which is the climate design value. And you can see that there's a certain probability of a climate parameter exceeding that infrastructure threshold. Click it again. With a change in climate, we see a shift in the parameter such that the probability of it being exceeding our infrastructure threshold increases as time goes on. And therefore, this is the kind of thing that we need to account for as we design, operate, and maintain our infrastructure. And the fact is that we have a lot of uncertainty associated with exactly how that climate is going to change going forward. And there's a whole notion, which I was mentioned in my introduction, around the PEO-Peterborough protocol, which is assessing the risks and uncertainty of climate going forward, taking into account the changes in the climate parameters. Next one. So what are we seeing with the impacts of climate? This is some insurance data that's been collected over the last number of years, and we've seen a huge economic cost, $21 billion in insured losses over the last 12 years, according to some databases of collecting of claims and so forth. In 2020 alone, there was 2.2 billion. And these are from a range of events. You can see some of the photos there of different extreme events that have happened related to rains, floods, high winds, hail in Calgary. Also, of course, wildland fire, which is exacerbated by extreme temperatures and dryness. Next one. And this is a plot just showing over the last number of years the costs in the billions of dollars, and there's various extreme events. I guess one of the things that you see is that climate events have no shame, in the sense that they happen all over Canada. They're happening more frequently and in places that we haven't seen extreme events before. For example, tornadoes in Southern Ontario are much more frequent and having huge impacts on infrastructure. Next one. So there's many examples. I could have shown a million pictures here around different climate events, but this was one that's close to home in Toronto that was back a number of years ago, related to Finch Avenue. And this was a sequence of pictures that somebody happened to be there taking them of a progressive failure of a culvert. The upper right is the start of the failure, and the lower right is the end result of the failure. And this failure took place over about a half an hour. Extreme rain event, about 150 millimeters of rain over about 3 hours, very localized. At the same time that this storm was happening, there was about 30 millimeters of rain happening at Toronto Airport. And essentially what happened here is that the culvert was partially blocked with vegetation that hadn't been cleared and inspected through operational and maintenance procedures. The water built up behind the culvert. And of course, it was not designed to be a dam, and so it ended up failing. The loss of this infrastructure, it cost about $10 million to repair this infrastructure. Finch Avenue was lost as an arterial road for 9 months. And in addition to these public infrastructure impacts, there's about $500 million in basement flooding claims in the local area. Next one. One of the things about infrastructure, of course, is that it's not just the road that was affected, but a number of other infrastructure services. You can see that were broken here, water mains, maintenance conduits, cables, and so forth. Fortunately, the high pressure gas mains you see in the upper left were not severed. It could have been a lot more of an impact and with safety wise if those had blown, but they didn't. But the point here is that we design infrastructure in corridors, and so when an impact of one infrastructure fails, many others do, noting the notion of interdependencies of infrastructure. So that's something we have to keep in mind, particularly in urban areas and areas which share common areas for different types of infrastructure. Next one. So I wanted to just make a note to everyone that there is a public guideline that was published by Engineers Canada that I was deeply involved in creating the original guideline, and then an addition to it, which had to deal with mitigation. So we have, this is on the Engineers Canada website. At the bottom of the page there is the actual URL, but these are the principles. And I would like to encourage all engineers to review this guideline and incorporate these principles, into your practice. Of course, as Engineers Canada, we're not a we're not a regulator, but we do provide guidelines that reflect the consensus view of all the regulators across Canada. And just to point out a couple of these, of course, is to always consider climate change, adaptation, and resiliency. Also the notion of mitigation and reduction of greenhouse gases. One of the things about our standards is that some of them are quite dated, have not been updated to reflect most current climate data or projections of climate data. So you should use those with caution and make sure that they're up to date, or at least use them as a starting point in your engineering work. Also, things like, this is a very collaborative type of practice where you're working with others that include planners, climate scientists, other professionals that deal with infrastructure, procurement, etc. So it's a multidisciplinary, multifaceted type of practice that's required to deal with this kind of issue. And I guess the last point there, you might see legal liabilities. Well, the notion here is that you, if you don't consider climate change in your practice, you may be subject to professional liability, particularly going forward, as you should be aware of the fact that the climate is changing, and where you can, and in accordance to your client's instructions, you should be considering it in your work. Next one. PEO has not been absent in this space over the years, but it's been fairly infrequent in its commentary around it. There's certainly that guideline that I just reviewed there. An earlier version that dealt with adaptation only is on the PEO website and has been recommended as something that all engineers should consider, but I encourage you to look at the most recent guideline that includes the mitigation side of things. But these are some messages from was included in the engineering dimensions that climate change adaptation is not only an accepted part of daily practice, but a guiding principle of professional practice. And you should make reasonable efforts to incorporate adaptation. And this also involves communicating with your client and to the public around the impacts and what is being done to address climate change impacts. Next one. So just to conclude, first click it once, if you can. Yeah, so we have events. We have a lot of extreme events that have defined our profession, and we have to deal and react to those. And climate change, as has been pointed out, is a huge issue now and in the future. We as engineers need to be engaged and participate in it vigorously at not only a practice level, but I believe also in a policy level, engaging with governments who set standards and policies in place. Next one. And we can't rely on conventional practice to deal with this issue. We need to innovate. We need to consider how to deal with the climate. I've suggested that understanding the risks and vulnerabilities related to infrastructure is a good first step, but this must be followed with follow through into incorporating those kinds of risks to prioritize your design and also in the operations and maintenance side of infrastructure. And I think that's it. Next one. Or is that it? I think that's it. So thanks, and turn it back to the moderator. Thanks.
Thanks very much, David, for an exceptional presentation. Very interesting and very important. I should have briefly introduced your introducer, who is Ayat Hama-Saleh. She's an executive board member of the East Toronto chapter and also the past president of the Speakers Club of Ryerson Engineering. Next, to introduce our next speaker, Harshan Radhakrishnan, is Alex Chisholm. Alex is a member of the Toronto Engineering Club of Speakers and a former secretary of that group. Alex.
Thank you. So, as the manager, climate change and sustainability initiatives, Harshan deals with 1, management of programs and initiatives that help to address sustainability and climate change adaptation and mitigation in the practice of the professions. 2, outreach to provincial and municipal governments technical groups, and others in relation to climate change and sustainability strategies. Harshan is a professional engineer registered with Engineers and Geoscientists in BC and Alberta with 10+ years of experience in environmental regulation, oversight of regulatory programs, as well as an in-depth understanding of the municipal, provincial, and federal regulatory requirements. He provides staff support for Engineers and Geoscientists BC's climate change and sustainability advisory groups, and plays a key role in supporting the implementation of Engineers and Geoscientists BC's Climate Change Action Plan. Thank you. Back to you, Jim.
You're on, Harshan.
Jim, would you like to introduce Malcolm as well? Because Malcolm is the current chair of Engineers and Geoscientists.
Okay, sure.
BC's
If Ashley, do you mind introducing the speaker that's going to run right on with Harshan?
Absolutely.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jim. So Dr. Malcolm Shield is a professional engineer and project management professional with more than 15 years of experience in carbon management and low carbon technology. For 6 years, Malcolm was lead advisor to the Mayor and Council, as well as senior management for the City of Vancouver on all matters related to greenhouse gases and emissions reductions. Malcolm has sat on advisory committees for the World Bank, the Province of BC, Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, Electric Mobility Canada, and UC Davis, California. He brings international perspectives through his work with the C40 initiative to develop evidence-based carbon reduction targets and climate action plans. After 2+ years of leading climate action work through the consulting sector, he has recently joined West Group Properties as their VP Sustainability to lead their low carbon utility work and ESG planning. Please welcome Dr. Malcolm Shields, and followed by Harshan.
Thanks a lot, folks, for the warm introduction. I just want to make sure that everybody can see my screen here. Can I get a thumbs up from somebody? Good stuff. Appreciate PEO, Jim in particular, for the leadership in putting this event together, and all the staff and volunteers that are supporting this in the background. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you, myself and Malcolm included, are speaking to you from the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And if you folks are wanting to understand what the Indigenous history is where you live and what the communities are, you can visit this website called native-land.ca. So with that as a starting point, I'd like to take this opportunity to really share with you a story, the journey that Engineers and Geoscientists BC as a regulatory body took to develop its climate change action plan, and the significant amount of engagement that it carried out to support the plan development. And along the way, I'll also provide a timeline of what are all the activities that were supported by EGBC's Climate Change Advisory Group that actually provided the base for building the foundations for the plan development. So just to provide a broad strokes overview of why EGBC has developed a plan, I just want to set the context by saying that EGBC is not alone in acting in this space and trying to support all of civil society by modeling the way and leading by example and doing its part to contribute to taking action on climate change. You can see on the screen that, senior governments, provincial governments, industry associations, as well as our fellow counterpart professional regulatory bodies and associations have all stepped up to the plate to provide support to taking action on climate change, whether it being support for reducing emissions or adapting to climate change. And EGBC as an organization that is aware of its regulatory mandate, wanted to figure out how it can act in a manner that is sympathetic to taking action on climate change and promoting sustainability, and more importantly, have a proactive approach in terms of supporting its registrants in reducing emissions and adapting to climate change. So my presentation is going to be talking a lot about the 2018 AGM motion that resulted in Council looking at putting together a comprehensive climate change action plan to support registrants in addressing this issue. It's also going to be talking a lot about the engagement we did and how we heard wide support from registrants for EGBC to be playing a role, and what are the areas in which they wanted EGBC to support them on. And I also want to note that the plan is not something that we are talking about in theory. It's a plan that has been unanimously approved by Engineers and Geoscientists BC at their council meeting in November 2020, and implementation is well underway. So within the next 20-25 minutes, I'm hoping to cover all of that. So stay with me here. So in terms of the timeline of climate change related initiatives, as I mentioned, the plan was approved in 2020, but we had climate change related initiatives right from, I would say, 2010, where Council put together a climate change task force that led to the development of the Climate Change Advisory Group back in 2012. In fact, EGBC's Climate Change Advisory Group is one of the longest running climate advisory groups. It's going to be celebrating its 10th year anniversary shortly. And since the Climate Change Advisory Group was established, they were quite influential in setting the tone for providing the regulatory body with tools to support regulation of the practice of professions through position statements that dealt with adapting to climate change, and perhaps suggesting that engineers need to consider their role on climate change, and how that ties with the Code of Ethics obligations. And so that was done with quite significant consultation, member engagement, and the timeline then was like the 2014 was the adaptation position paper, 2016 mitigation position paper. What Engineers and Geoscientists BC did to support those position statements was to actually come up with professional practice guidelines that deal with adapting to climate change. We had an opportunity to work with BC Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure that was already a leader in terms of applying the PIVC protocol in carrying out infrastructure vulnerability assessments. And they wanted to formalize the process of risk assessment and adaptation decision-making through a set of professional practice guidelines. So we were able to kind of not just say that engineers need to consider climate change, but actually provide them with tools through professional practice guidelines. And along the way, the province of BC came up with a voluntary pathway under the BC Building Code for municipalities to build progressively from better-than-based building code all the way to net zero ready by 2032. And they established performance metrics within the BC Building Code, and Engineers Geoscientists BC, in association with the Architectural Institute of BC, developed a set of professional practice guidelines that deal with greenhouse gas emissions reductions within the built environment in support of not just the BC Energy Step Code, but in relation to meeting rating systems and incentives, facilities management, in relation to optimization and forecasting, and of course, for code compliance reasons. So along the way, the CCAG was quite influential in terms of carrying out member survey. And I can get into a little bit of that detail in the next slide. all of this work fed into the AGM motion that came to the council table in 2018 that requested council to look into developing the plan. And that set into motion the foundations for the plan. And as a result of that, the Climate Change Advisory Group put together a steering group that helped oversaw the development of the plan. The plan development involved significant consultations. I can get into that into the future slides as well. But this just goes to show the role that Engineers and Geoscientists BC or a regulatory body could be playing to support their registrants in responding to climate change. And even prior to the plan development, EGBC has dedicated staff resources. I'm a full-time climate FTE, if you will. My mandate is to support climate change related practice areas and also to provide support for other governments, not-for-profit stakeholders and other stakeholders that have existing initiatives underway. And we host numerous advisory groups, divisions, communities of practice. Divisions include the Environmental Professionals Division, the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Division. And we are tuned into other communities of practice like the BC Professional Association Adaptation Working Group and federally through the Infrastructure and Buildings Working Group. I already mentioned about the practice guidelines. The key role that we play in terms of disseminating the latest climate science as it relates to the practice of professional engineering is through the Climate Change Information Portal. Granted, 90% of the resources that are there relate to climate change adaptation, and the resources that we maintain in relation to mitigation are specific to building sector, but we take it upon ourselves to maintain the Climate Change Information Portal so that that becomes a reference point in the absence of codes and standards and requirements that relate to that for engineers to try and understand what are the resources and requirements that relate to climate that they need to be aware of. And we do engage standard setting bodies. What I mean by that is not just with the Canadian Standards Association or through the Buildings and Safety Standard branch at the province of BC, but in working with social housing sector, for example, in working with other, the Public Construction Council, and they all feed into the evolution of code standards, policies, bylaws. So the role in helping shape public policy is something that we do in consideration of the regulatory mandate that EGBC has. And a huge role we play is providing improved access to continuing education. And I'm happy to say that even though EGBC provides, from the staff perspective, some projects, showcasing case studies and events in relation to practice guidelines, there, because we have an active climate change focused community of practice, there's starting to be a lot more continuing education opportunities because we have enabled that knowledge sharing. So just wanted to talk a little bit about the 2017 Climate Change Awareness Survey and the learnings that we had as EGBC from that. Right out the gate, what we did understand was that 3 out of 4 respondents felt that taking action on climate change should be urgent. But having said that, only 1 out of the 4 respondents felt that Engineers and Geoscientists BC was doing enough to support registration efforts, even though, as the previous slide mentioned, we were doing all those things. In reality, the response was that they were either unaware or they were not using the resources that we were offering them. So we had to use this information when we started to engage, when we developed this plan. In fact, that actually provided fodder for structuring our engagement objectives. We definitely wanted to raise the awareness about the impacts of climate change. We also wanted to improve the awareness of the regulatory body's existing resources. We definitely wanted to identify issues, challenges, and opportunities, and look at who are all the engineers and geoscientists that are actually doing this work. As we speak, governments have climate solutions engineers. There's community energy managers. There's actual roles within consulting industry with climate related roles. And we wanted to actually engage those to really find out what are the trends, what are the areas of practice that really contribute to taking action on climate change. And for the engagement process, we engaged the registrants through branches, through the divisions, through our own internal communities. We developed a discussion paper, and that solicited about 45 written submissions. Sorry about that. So I was just saying, for the engagement process, we developed a discussion paper that resulted in 45 written submissions. We hosted multiple town hall style webinars, including through our conference. We hosted a number of focus groups where we identified 10 practice areas that are most impacted or would have most to contribute towards taking action on climate change. And we structured a lot of one-on-one interviews with subject matter experts. And we, of course, worked lockstep with EGBC's internal departments and senior leadership team to make sure that everybody is well coordinated in terms of the information that we were getting. In terms of the stakeholders, from our perspective, the decision maker was obviously Engineers Geoscientists Council. And who was accountable? It was Engineers Geoscientists BC's middle management, which included myself and folks from the communications team. And who was responsible? Because the action was assigned to the Climate Change Advisory Group, the steering committee became the responsible party along with the consultant team that helped supported the development of the plan. And we consulted widely. We consulted, of course, with the senior management team. We consulted with membership, government, other engineering regulators, industry sectors, and specialist organizations. And along the way, we had the responsibility to keep people informed through reaching out with our What We Heard report and reaching out about engagement opportunities and so on. So another way to kind of explain this is showing the plan development process through this graphic here. Essentially, to kickstart this process, we did a peer review of who has existing climate change related plans, which other engineering regulatory bodies internationally, North America wide, and other professionals, maybe planners, architects, what do they have? And what we found at the time was actually slim pickings in terms of relevance for regulatory applicability for a regulatory body such as Engineers Geoscientists BC. So what we did was we developed a discussion paper that built on what Engineers Geoscientists BC was already doing and really asked questions about whoever it is that was willing to respond to say, what do you think is the role that EGBC can be playing in this space to be effective and having that value add? And we came up with an engagement plan. I already talked about the various ways we engaged, and we arrived at 75 plus actions that we were having to kind of screen. We had to screen them from the point of view of their effectiveness. We had to screen them from the point of view of whether it fits with the EGBC's regulatory mandate. We had to screen them from the point of view was how practically achievable it would be for EGBC with the existing resources it had. So there were multiple screens placed. And you can read all about it in the What We Heard report, which we released. And there was no filtering of the actions within the What We Heard report. But we did carry out a lot of screening related actions, and you can see the impact alignment there. And we did all this work, and we worked with communications to put together a package for council with some information on what kind of resources would be required, what sort of implementation actions that would represent sort of early start actions that we could be taking. And I was thrilled to note that, in fact, when I say it was all staff at EGBC was thrilled to learn that council was unanimously supportive of endorsing this plan. And the plan was launched in March of 2021. Implementation is already underway. We are targeting a 3-year kind of horizon where we would kind of track milestones and consider how we would revise the plan at the end of the 3 years. But implementation is already underway, and it builds on EGBC's already existing initiatives. So what did we hear? Just so that you have a little bit of an understanding, the stuff on the left-hand side of the slide all deals with what we heard in relation to adaptation. The stuff on the right deals with what we heard in relation to greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And we heard a lot. So there were people that were concerned about EGBC going too far. There were others that were saying, we are not going far enough. There were folks that were saying, the tools and the technologies are all there. It's just a matter of scaling up. And on the other side, they were saying, yeah, the tools are there, but it's prohibitively costly. It's not affordable. So all said and done, what we heard loud and clear is widespread interest in knowledge sharing. And we heard loud and clear about the interest from registrants to support efforts to get to net zero by 2050 and be part of the climate solutions, and really recognize the fact that engineers are oftentimes the ones called upon to deliver solutions. And what we heard loud and clear is EGBC, in its role as a regulator, is well positioned to support knowledge exchange and play a facilitating role in this area. And with that, we came up with 2 complementary goals that went into the plan, one relating to adapting to climate change and the other relating to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the words were carefully chosen here that says support registrants, right? So that's the role that EGBC can play. It's a supportive role to make sure that we develop the capacity of registrants to effectively assess and manage climate risk within their practice of professional engineering and geoscience. With GHG emissions, it's supporting registrants to develop and implement solutions to reduce GHGs. And given the regulatory mandate that the EGBC has, the 4 broad action areas that were identified related to leadership and collaboration, leadership pertaining to modeling the way, leading by example, and doing our part to take action on climate change and promoting sustainability. And collaboration refers to all the partnerships that we could be having with stakeholders to support each other's climate-related initiatives. And there's a huge role that we play in terms of registration and competencies. It's about understanding how we take away barriers for the generation of engineers and geoscientists that are coming in the future, and how we can enable them and how we can grow these areas of practice that relate to taking action on climate change and promoting sustainability. Education and knowledge sharing is all about enabling the communities of practice and providing pathways through our conference and elsewhere, through branch events and through division events and so on. And practice resources refers to our efforts in keeping not just climate specific practice guidelines, but making sure whenever we develop new or revise existing practice guidelines, we apply a climate lens to see what are all the climate related impacts that members should be aware of, and what are all the opportunities to ameliorate climate impacts and reduce emissions that can be built into these practice guidelines. So I don't want to dwell too much into this, but this provides a clear snapshot of those 4 broad areas. Essentially, the 10 actions that lie within this plan that relates to the regulatory mandate that EGBC has. So it's essentially articulating what EGBC is already doing and providing a little more of structure and providing linkages to key performance indicators that can be ultimately tied to Engineers Geoscientists BC's strategic plan that will go to show how Engineers and Geoscientists BC has a proactive as well as a strategic approach in dealing with climate change. So in terms of the key considerations, Engineers and Geoscientists BC fully recognizes that we are but one regulator in Canada. And while there aren't a lot of models for what climate change related actions could look like for a regulatory body, we fully intended this plan to be a role model for other professional regulatory bodies. And it provides a strategic direction and a strategic framework for action. In fact, like I mentioned, we already have KPIs that relate to practice guidelines, that relate to events, that relate to how do we support mentorship opportunities, that relate to registration and competencies. And it's fully well aligned with the mandate of Engineers and Geoscientists BC under the Professional Governance Act. So that's a slight change in the regulatory regime that's specific to BC, where all the professions that have roles in relation to the natural resources sector are being regulated under this umbrella legislation. And it reinforces the regulatory role rather than the member advocacy role that Engineers Geoscientists BC has. But we fully made sure that the action plan that we developed was sympathetic to the regulatory role that Engineers and Geoscientists BC has. And it focuses on supporting registrants, not so much grandstanding, not so much being on the high horse, but realizing that it's a shared journey that we are all in this together, and really shouldering some of that responsibility and enabling these communities of practice to support knowledge sharing. It certainly builds on Engineers and Geoscientists BC's current climate change initiatives, and it is dynamically responsible to resources and opportunities. As a matter of fact, since the release of the plan, we've had several requests for partnerships where we've formed partnership agreements with other stakeholders to be developing practice resources and offering continuing education events. And we have organized the plan in such a way that it enables tracking of progress, and the implementation can be pursued in a phased approach, with resources identified, with budget identified. So there's a token budget, ongoing budget that's associated that EGBC has access to, that can be strategically leveraged to enable partnership and collaboration and to model the way in terms of the core responsibilities that Engineers and Geoscientists can uniquely deliver on. In terms of the implementation, I'm happy to say that since we released the plan, we have introduced 2 new areas of practice, one relating to climate risk management, the other relating to climate science. And as of today, I just checked, there were already 120 engineers and geoscientists that have declared either climate risk management or climate science as their areas of practice. We are well into the weeds of carrying out partnership mapping in terms of looking at who are the other stakeholders that have existing initiatives, who else can we be engaging in relation to our plan, and what are the potential opportunities. And I already talked about partnership agreements. We've also signed some memorandum of understanding with industry groups to commit us to working together in terms of developing professional practice guidelines, and to be able to have a joint coordinated approach in terms of responding to requests for consultation, for example. We are well into the weeds of integrating the plan into Engineers Geoscientists BC's operations. The Climate Change Advisory Group is actively looking into mentorship opportunities. There are twice as many mentees as there are mentors, and there are a lot more younger engineers that want to be trained or want to have somebody to talk to share ideas in relation to climate change and sustainability. And we wanted to make sure that we enable that by providing pathways for that to happen and making sure that there are no barriers for entry into practice for folks that are having climate-focused careers. And supporting the community of practice. I already talked about the multiple communities that EGBC works with. You know, we work with the branches, we work with the divisions, we work with other professional associations in terms of developing joint responses and supporting others with their events and so on. But it's a journey. And we are happy that we are on this journey, and we're willing to collaborate with everyone. So I'll pause there and I'll turn it over to the current chair of Engineers and Geoscientists BC's Climate Change Advisory Group, Malcolm Shield. He's been quite an influence with respect to the development of the Climate Change Action Plan. He stepped out of the advisory group to provide consulting services for the development of the plan. So I asked him to kind of speak to you folks from one member to another so that you hear not just the regulatory body employees' perspective, but somebody that can speak from one member to another. So over to you, Malcolm.
Thanks, Harshan, much appreciated. Yeah, so my history with the Climate Change Advisory Group goes right back to 2012 when the group was first established. And as Harshan said, I played a more significant role through the consultant team, which supported the association in developing the Climate Action Plan. And I now chair the Climate Change Advisory Group. And so I'd say, from my perspective, I think the key takeaways that I'd like to highlight based upon the journey that Harshan's taken you through is, first and foremost, a recognition that climate change presents a risk. And what do we mean by presenting a risk? Well, it presents a risk to the association, in that we heard loud and clear from the membership that they weren't being supported to the extent that they wished on how to deal with the challenges presented by climate change, both on the adaptation side, the responding to the physical impacts, and the mitigation side, support to stop driving climate change. So from the association's perspective, there's a risk that needed to be addressed that was providing better registrant support. But then for our registrants, climate change also provides a risk, in essence, because the future that we're looking for engineered, and also in BC's case, the geoscience projects, the future that they're being planned for and moving into is substantively different to the past past. And as such, past data is less indicative of where we are heading. The standards and codes that are in place are often not fit for a future climate. And this presents a shortage of practical skills on the practitioner's side as to how to use the skills that they have, how they need to be amended, access to information, how to use that information, not just from a hard skills point of view, but an interpretation point of view. And so we use that risk basis really to shape up the role of the association. And that is consistent with where we see the strongest climate action amongst clients in BC. That is very much coming from large industry and PSOs, the public sector organizations, that's to say government and its various related arms. And we do see those emergent areas where adaptation and mitigation overlap through social housing, health considerations. And so you can see that the landscape is becoming more complicated in terms of expectations for some big spenders within the province. And so we as an organization need to be able to support that. But at the same time, we're also seeing local, provincial, regional governments play their role in providing growing and clearer direction on their expectations of climate change. We're lucky to have good support locally around future climate projections. And so there's an emergent risk, but the landscape is starting to solidify at the same time. And really it is this bringing together of a profession that is used to working to codes and standards, and in an overly simplified way, working within a very tight sandbox of what is and isn't acceptable. Climate change is forcing our practitioners out of that comfort, and in many ways asking engineers and geoscientists to apply their existing skills, but in quite a different context. So next slide, please, Harshan. And with that, it really comes down to, well, how do our members meet client needs while still staying true to what is required of them as a professional, and particularly in areas that are emergent, such as requirements that are in place for funding. Not, I'd say, standards and codes, but requirements, particularly from the federal government. We're starting to see more private industry paying attention to the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That is that climate risk is starting to turn up through financial conduits. And once that is starting to come together, that genesis has been around for a while, there is now a growing conversation around beyond operational and immediate emissions release and the need to respond to a physical climate. Long-term, what is the systemic consideration around life cycle considerations, embodied carbon, looking at a more holistic approach to co-benefits. And so really this entire risk and opportunity landscape is what the climate plan in EGBC's case is looking to achieve. And we would also posit that it's the approach that we would like to see other regulators take. Fundamentally, what's the issue? What are the current issues to be dealt with? What are the emergent issues? And then when we look at that, how do we look to solutions that are both risk management, downside management, but also upside management, and making the most of the opportunities for our registrants and practitioners? So I think with that, that's the end of the tag team from Harshan and I. We're back to the moderator at this point.
Okay, thanks so much, Harshan and Malcolm. What a fantastic presentation. Lots of stuff to think about for us here in Ontario. So thank you very much. I'd like to call on Darren to introduce our next speaker. And Darren is the president of the Speakers Club of Ryerson Engineering, and they are one of the co-sponsors of this meeting. Darren?
Thank you, Jim. I would like to introduce our next speaker. Curt Hull, P.Eng, has a consulting practice in sustainability and is currently the project director of Climate Change Connection in Winnipeg. Prior to his involvement in climate change, he worked for 23 years as director of quality systems for a Winnipeg-based electronics design and manufacturing company. During that 23 years, Curt was instrumental in growing the company from 12 to over 1,000 employees in 5 countries. Curt changed careers in 2007 and began educating Manitobans about climate change. He joined the Climate Reality Project Canada and was trained by former US President Al Gore in 2010. He works with many NGOs, universities and colleges, as well as all levels of government. He currently serves on the board of Sustainable Building Manitoba. Since 2018, Curt has been working on various climate change task groups and initiatives for Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba. Ladies and gentlemen, Curt Hull.
Well, thank you very much, Darren. And thank you for that introduction. And thank you for the invitation, Jim, to meet with this group and to share some of the activities that are going on here in Manitoba. So greetings from Winnipeg, Manitoba, from Treaty 1 territory that I share, and where the Assiniboine River meets the Red. Now, what I'm going to share with you for just in a few minutes is the activities that the association is currently engaged in, plus a direction that we are proposing to the council and administration of the association as to where we as advisory groups think that the association should be headed. So the first part of it here is where we are, the activities that we are undertaking right now. And this is the BRACE program. It's a federal initiative from NRCan, and there are BRACE projects going on currently across the country in all of the provinces and territories, I believe. And so in Manitoba, the BRACE project is been branded by the Manitoba government. We're working with a number of other sectors. You can see at the bottom here that these other sectors to develop courses of training for practitioners in various disciplines with respect to climate change adaptation being the focus. So this is what the Manitoba government and we are calling the Manitoba Climate Resilience Training Program. And so the objective of this activity that we're engaged in right now from our sector is to train and develop capacity for practitioners up to 500 engineers, owners, developers, and other decision makers. So what we're undertaking is development of the capacity for infrastructure professionals and decision makers to incorporate climate change adaptation primarily in their practice. And the way that we've been going about it is from our own infrastructure stream. There's also the stream for planners and for northern business and an indigenous sector and an overarching integrator from ICLEI is helping us all coordinate our tasks and our activity. So we've got a project team that is working on this diligently, but there's also advisory groups that you're seeing here, the Sustainable Development Task Group and the BRACE Infrastructure Project Working Group, a couple of different groups of advisors, practitioners that are advising us as to where we should go. Now, this project, we've been working on it actively for about a year and a bit, but just over a year, but it's actually started in 2018. This initiative has started in 2018, and we've developed over the course of that time a number of studies and reports. And so, it really started in February of 2018 and then moved through 2019 when the provincial government put forward a request for proposals, and then all of the really detailed work has been undertaken since October of last year. And so the progress that we what we've done is engaged with stakeholders in a number of sessions and received feedback. I'll get back to the feedback we got from the member survey, as well as some other questionnaires. And so currently where we're at is the development of content, not just for our stream, but also for those other streams that I mentioned. So the colors represent the different sectors, the different sector streams, and they're being managed by other organizations. Ours is the light blue, and I'm project manager for this initiative with the association. And so you can see that we've got a menu of courses that we're developing with respect to climate change adaptation and from the different sectors. And we're going, the intention is that there will be a recommended stream for infrastructure professionals, but the whole smorgasbord will be made available to whoever has interest in the province. And so we're really looking forward to, we're just starting next week with some e-news for the association, just to whet people's appetite to this and start getting them interested in where we're headed. And currently where we're at is development of content, and primarily in those three modules that you saw that were in the light blue in that previous slide. So we're working on a couple of modules with Northern Business and with a practitioner, Jeff O'Driscoll, who's well familiar with training at PEO-VC and infrastructure climate risk assessment. We're working with Red River College and others on an introduction to how climate change is affecting code standards and regulations. And then the third module that we're working on is nature-based infrastructure solutions. We're working with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, Prairie Climate Center, and others on that one. So that, in a nutshell, is what Manitoba, the Manitoba Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba, is currently engaged in. That's a project that's ongoing right now, and in its current phase, slated to be completed by the end of March 2022, but with the hope that what we've developed here won't end April 1st, but instead be continually augmented, enhanced, and redeployed as time goes on. So that's the first part, where we are at. But now I'm going to talk about where we intend to, or where we're proposing to move, and that is towards what we're calling the initiative is environment and climate change. And the reason for that wording is that the intention is to follow the lead that Harshan and Malcolm just shared with us, and that's the direction that Engineers Geoscientists British Columbia has gone through. But to create a strategic plan over the course of a number of months in the near future, to come up and through the engagement similar to what EGBC did, to come up with a strategic plan which will focus on climate change at this stage, but the initiative being structured and prepared to move into broader environmental stewardship and environmental issues. So the intention, just like EGBC did, was to give council the context and background upon which to take well-informed action as an association, as it responds to the needs of our registrants, society at large, in a changing climate. So that's what we're proposing, what we're headed towards. And there's in order to build this case, like we have to convince the board of directors and administration of the association that this is appropriate for a registrar to do this, because it's a bit out of the ordinary of what registrars are used to doing. So the three primary arguments or rationale that we're focusing on is similar to what Malcolm and Harshan were mentioning, is this idea of risk and how there are various aspects of risk. And we're really fortunate to have Malcolm working directly with us on this project and sharing with us the experiences that he had over the course of the last decade almost. And also we're in communication with Harshan, and thank you very much for that contribution as we move forward. And so rationale number one is primarily, and the primary rationale is risk management and having, giving our members, the association, an ability to address the risk that may be associated with this issue. Another rationale came from a survey that we conducted last year, or earlier this year rather, where we put out a survey similar to a survey that was done nationally in 2017 by Engineers Canada. And we had a very encouraging response rate to that survey that we sent out. Our membership is in approximately 8,500 members, and we got just over 1,000 responses back. And there's a comprehensive set of insights that we received from that survey. Probe Research here in Manitoba helped us with that. But a couple of the key sort of takeaways from that survey was that 91% of the respondents acknowledged the role of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions on climate change. And moreover, 85% recognize that climate will or has already impacted their practice. So when it comes to a registrar serving the needs of the membership, I think there's a really compelling argument or evidence here from that survey. And then the third rationale has to do with the various ethical obligations and strategic objectives that the association has put before itself, with in broad terms relate to our responsibility to protecting the public and the environment. And so in a nutshell, that's a rationale or a reason. There may be arguments about whether, how you interpret ethics, but we believe that responding appropriately to climate change is well within the realm of an ethical responsibility. And moreover, here in Manitoba, there's a very important aspect of the Professional Engineers Act, which gives us a responsibility to advocate in those cases where we believe the public interest is at risk. And so that's another aspect of the rationale, an ethical and obligation for the association. And then we did a peer review similar to what EGBC did, where we did a review of other jurisdictions, engineering jurisdictions across Canada, as well as other professional associations and what they're up to. And the landscape has shifted only slightly, I think, since EGBC did theirs a few years ago. But there are other associations, they're listed here, that have, and our EGBC being the key one, with their the release of their paper, and we hope to work and work collaboratively with more and more organizations as this thing goes through. So what we're looking at is basically a 3-year initiative here at this stage, with implementation following on with a lot more, but with implementation being informed by a considerable amount of engagement and feedback and discussion and development in a really professional way. So that, in a nutshell, is where Manitoba is at and where hopefully we're headed.
Thank you, Curt. Great work, and wish you the best of success for what you're doing in the future. Lots for us to learn here in Ontario as well from what you said. The bad news, well, we have one more speaker actually before we get into that. David Lapp has already been introduced. He's a retired member from Engineers Canada and has done a lot of work on this issue in that capacity. So David, you want to give a more pan-Canadian outlook here? Go ahead, David. You're muted, David, muted.
Louis, could you put up the slides for that one, please? Yeah, so I'm going to present what I did in preparing for this seminar. Was I contacted a couple of the other regulators, your fellow regulators, to see what they're doing through, and part of that was through my knowledge and engagement with those regulators in my role at Engineers Canada. And in particular, so I asked them to prepare a few slides. that'll go through quickly, just to show you that there are a number of regulators. We've heard from BC and Manitoba, but we're also going to hear now about Newfoundland and Labrador and also New Brunswick, recognizing that the OIQ, Quebec, is also doing a considerable amount of work in this area as well. But in the interest of time and preparation, I focused in on those two regulators. And so these slides are been prepared by them, and I'm presenting them to the group here on their behalf. So next slide. So the notion from P.Eng, as I'll call them for Newfoundland and Labrador, is similar to what Curt just presented, and also Harshan, that this dealing with this issue is closely tied to the Code of Ethics. Just to give you a sense, P.Eng has a membership of about 5,000. New Brunswick has just under 6,000. So they're much smaller regulators, at least in terms of membership and, of course, the resources that are available. In the context of P.Eng, they have, similar to the others, a Code of Ethics that holds paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public and protection of the environment. So climate change having an impact on all of those things, I guess, prompted them to put attention to this issue. And they have to make their holders aware of their professional responsibilities. That and in particular, because of the notion we've heard already about codes and standards, some of them are dated, but they really serve as a starting point to deal with climate going forward. So you certainly need to be aware of your codes and standards, but also recognize that in the context of future climate, these are changing, and you may or may not have updates to those, but to keep that principle in mind. And their I guess focus on this goes back a few years, and the fact is, around the codes and standards that is designing to code enough, and that they have an article in there about that, and particularly relating to climate change and the codes that may not be keeping up with as the climate is changing. Next one. The other aspect that they reinforce in this whole notion of dealing with climate change is their continuing professional development program, which is mandatory. And one of the interesting features of their program that I didn't know about until I actually got these slides is that license holders can report hours in any of the categories, and in many of the regulators they have different categories of professional development that are formal and informal. But one of the requirements that they add is to report annually on the category of ethical practice, including sustainable development. So a portion of your professional development has to be shown to be in the area of sustainable development, and of course that embraces climate change. And it's really to raise awareness of the potential environmental, social, and economic impacts of the profession's work. So it's in that context that this requirement has been set by the P.Eng and has been in effect for the last 2 or 3 years, from what I understand. Next one. P.Eng is also participating in the BRACE program that was mentioned earlier. There's a BRACE project going on there, and their particular objective is to build regional capacity and expertise, particularly relating to adaptation and infrastructure resilience. And their focus is on training, on the methods of adaptation to climate change, the state of practice and training, and to develop a decision support tool for communities. There's a lot of smaller communities in Newfoundland, of course, and they need tools that they can use and work with engineers and planners and others. And P.Eng is part of a consortium of organizations that's involved in the BRACE project. It's actually being led by the Memorial University, but they are a participant, and they are publicizing the outputs of this program and engaging license holders to participate and increase the awareness of the expectations of they have on professionals. Next one. So the work that they've had is they have set up a building climate resilience steering committee, and the participants in that committee are listed there. And then it's an interesting cross section here of the local university, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, Paganel itself, of course, NRCan is a sponsor, Engineers Canada, and the municipalities of Newfoundland and Labrador and the planners. So it's a consortium of representatives that steer this program around building capacity. They've had three conferences that have been held over about a 2-year period. And out of those conferences, they've built online training modules. And if anyone's interested, I can get you the URLs. Those are publicly available. They also are operating a community of practice within Newfoundland and includes a newsletter. And they have a conference coming up in November. That's kind of the summary of their BRACE program, which ends in March 2022, as it does in Manitoba. That's shown here November 8th to 10th. And it's again, another capacity building opportunity and kind of to summarize where the program's come to and where it's going. So that's next slide. So that's kind of a summary of Newfoundland. And I think the important lesson there is that they're engaging with the universities and as part of the delivery of professional development. And when we turn to New Brunswick, the same situation exists there in the sense of they are working with their local universities, led by the University of Moncton, but also the University of New Brunswick, on a BRACE project that is focused on capacity building for New Brunswick engineers. Next slide. So these are the players that are involved, of course, Natural Resources Canada, the New Brunswick government, Engineers and Geoscientists New Brunswick, the 2 universities. But it is being managed through the University of Moncton. Next one. So the training here is just a listing here of some of the activities that they've got underway or are in progress, including things like the risk assessment toolkit, that whole theme of risk assessment and management. And they're developing, as to support that, local case studies, particularly focused on adaptation. And they've also held a number of webinars and conferences and operate and maintain a website. Next one. And they're also going beyond their borders with groups like the Canadian Standards Association to create a technical webinar series, best practices for training engineers, and developing adaptation resource pathways for engineers. So these are the kinds of examples, I think, of initiatives they're doing under the BRACE program. And so it's been a real shot in the arm, I think, for both New Brunswick and Newfoundland to be able to really engage and have resources to engage with engineers and other professionals. And you can see that they have both taken a collaborative approach, working with their provincial governments, their local universities, and other professional associations that are local to their jurisdiction to come up with these coordinated efforts and activities. And so I think these are good examples of smaller regulators and what they can do with the resources and focuses that they have. So I'll turn it back to the moderator.
David, thank you for the look at Newfoundland and New Brunswick. They're doing some good stuff, obviously. We don't have time for questions. That's the bad news. The good news is at the adjournment, there will be an informal session, just informal. People don't have to stay. And hopefully some of the speakers can stay to participate in that informal session. Next, I would like to call on the Vice President of the PEO, Marilyn Spink, to provide thank you to the 4 speakers and probably some comments around. Marilyn.
Hi, that was super informative. I really wanted to thank you, the speakers from EGBC, Harshan and Malcolm, and Carl from Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba, and David Lapp for sharing the tremendous amount of work that you've all been engaged with and done. I also wanted to thank the organizing committee as well, and Jim for his leadership. I'm just going to kudo that again. It's actually great seeing that PEO's registrar is here too. But really, most importantly, I wanted to thank all of you for taking the time to learn, and our speakers for sharing their knowledge, because this is collaboration is kind of, I think, get us where we need to be. I agree with Harshan. It's very much a journey, but we have to start that journey. And people often say that they want change, but the only thing we really can change is ourselves. And so we need to start from within and change our own selves. So I just want to thank everybody for investing their time to engage with this really important event and discussion. And whether you were organizing, speaking, or attending, and really time is the only thing that we have to give to one another. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marilyn. Great. Okay, next I'd like to call on the PEO, CEO and Registrar, Johnny Zucon, to give final concluding remarks. Johnny?
Well, thank you for the opportunity. And first off, kudos to the leadership of the West Toronto chapter for organizing such a informative and timely session, I think. And of course, my extended thanks to everyone who supported, promoted, and all of you who attended this informative event. I have to say that I really enjoyed hearing how our sister or neighbor regulatory bodies in BC and Manitoba are addressing the climate change issues, especially within their sphere of influence, and as well as learning, of course, about their initiatives that are stemming out of the national body from our good friend, David Lapp. David, nice to see you again. I think the presentations tonight, for me at least, have given me a lot to think about, especially when PEO is able and fully ready to turn its attention to addressing this issue. Some of you may know, PEO is currently undergoing an enterprise-wide transformation that's encompassing both governance, our entire operations, as well as our organizational framework. And while this occupies most of my time and that of council, we're all aware that this is likely going to be a priority item for future regulatory consideration. And I'm just giving a hint to our councillors, but I think in the near future, when we deal with the next strategic plan, we might want to really start looking at some of these things. But I think that the work we're undertaking right now will really ultimately create the appropriate governance and structural regime that can help facilitate effective discussion along an evidence-based decision-making process, really required to address such a critical subject. Having said that, though, climate change, as noted by David Lapp, is an issue that's been on our radar for quite some time. Any of you avid readers of our official magazine and Engineering Dimensions can attest to, as David highlighted in a couple of his slides. And in fact, the latest issue features an article from our practice standards team. Some who I think, when I last checked on this participant list, have joined us tonight. So that and that article, if you take the time to read it, really reminds engineers of their obligations to follow current professional standards and to look for and to account for foreseeable risks in their work, including those, of course, related to climate change. The piece also stresses the importance of being well informed, and we heard a lot about that tonight in terms of providing a resource for up-to-date information for registrants. And I have to say that the subject always generates the most buzz with our readers by far, which I think events like this are really important at advancing the dialogue in the broader engineering community. And really, we need to start looking deeper and discussing on just how related initiatives can best be considered within regulatory mandates such as those of our sister associations and PEO. Thank you again for the invitation to join tonight. It's always nice to see some new faces, even virtually. And with that, I'll turn it back to our lead counselor, Councillor Chisholm.
Thanks very much, Johnny, for your comments. Much appreciated. It's been a great session, and we've learned a lot about different provinces, what's happening. And I did notice a few chat comments of, what about Ontario? And I think this session opens up the possibility of having a session number 2, a seminar number 2, that focuses more on the role of engineers in Ontario on the climate change, on climate change. There will be a survey that goes out, and if you're interested in following the work of the climate change group, there is an opportunity to put your name forward. Finally, Luis, we have a poll. Can you put it up? A final poll just before adjournment? Yeah. So I'll give you 15 seconds to answer, and then we're going to adjourn. Yeah. Five seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, thanks. Can you share the poll, Luis? Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so that is the end of the formal session. I will adjourn the meeting at this point. But as I indicated, hang around if you want, and we'll have an informal discussion. So the meeting is formally adjourned at this point. Thank you for coming, everybody, and thank you especially to the West Toronto chapter, the East Toronto chapter, and the York chapter for sponsoring and co-sponsoring this event, and the many chapters that supported the event, and also the Speakers Club of Ryerson Engineering and the Toronto Engineering Club of Speakers, which also co-sponsored the event and helped out. So the meeting is now adjourned. Okay.
Well done, Jim.
Thank you, Marissa. Okay, I mean, it's the meeting's informal at this point. If people have any comments, just open up the mic and start talking. I know questions probably were there and there was no opportunity to ask them. Hopefully some of the speakers are still here. If people will want to just open their mic and ask a question or make a point. Go ahead.
Jim, I don't know if you want that I spotlight the four speakers, at least when they are speaking, the other people can see all of them.
Sure. Okay, so when the first speaker speaks, spotlight that person. So anybody that wants to go ahead with a comment or question, please go ahead.
Jim, a couple of questions came up regarding whether the PDFs or presentations will be available for the public. Yeah. Is there a location that they could find them?
Yes, unless there's any objection from any of the speakers, both the presentation and a video of this presentation will be on the West Toronto website, hopefully within a week. If any of the speakers have any problem with sharing their slides, please tell me either now or later.
Good with me.
No issues from my side.
Okay, good. Okay, again, just open your mic if you want to make a comment or ask a question.
Jim McConaughey here. Jim, since PEO split off its advocacy role to OSPI, I would hope that any effort on this regard would be a joint effort with OSPI, because that's where the advocacy body is. And I don't think it gets enough attention from PEO. It doesn't get enough support from PEO. And it certainly doesn't get enough